Hey guys, tonight we step back into the desert dusk of ancient Egypt, where the warm air shimmers like golden silk and every shadow hides a secret. The Nile is flowing lazily under the moonlight, fishermen's torches bob on the water, and somewhere deep in the city of Thebes, you hear laughter, muffled, playful, and maybe just a little scandalous. You've probably read about pyramids and mummies 100 times, but what about the lives people whispered about, the ones never carved into tomb walls? Tonight, we'll explore the streets where deals of the flesh and heart mixed with perfume, wine, and sly negotiation. You'll find beauty, danger, comedy, and the odd crocodile-related surprise, and honestly, you probably won't survive this if you try to keep a straight face. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing just how far these sleepy travels reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of Thebes, the ancient capital, and the night feels alive. Torches flicker against mud brick walls, painted doors are shut tight, and the rhythm of sandals on dusty streets echoes faintly. Markets have closed for the day, but life after dark is only beginning. And this is where the stories hide, tucked into alleyways scented with fried fish and cardamom. You walk slowly, your footsteps crunching in the sand, and notice little lanterns carved with lotus designs, a signal, maybe, to those who know. It's easy to think of Egypt as stiff and solemn, pyramids, rigid statues, priests in white linen, but the city at night was far from lifeless. Thebes had a pulse. Merchants, scribes, dancers, and those offering companionship strolled beneath the same moon you're looking at now. Some were there to entertain, others to console, and some simply to make enough bread, or beer, to survive another week. A mainstream fact slips in here: prostitution wasn't always officially recorded in Egyptian texts, but taverns and inns doubled as hubs for such encounters. Archaeologists have found references to women working in houses of beer, places where fermented barley flowed and company could be bought. Imagine a blend of bar, music hall, and shadowy backroom deal. You can almost smell the hops, earthy and sour, clinging to your robe. And then, there are the quirky bits. A few papyri suggest that some workers carried small pots of honey, not just for sweetness but as a kind of cosmetic enhancer, dabbed on lips, or mixed with perfumed oils. Sticky, yes, but effective when paired with kohl-lined eyes and wigs scented with cinnamon. Historians still argue whether this was a practical tool of the trade or simply one of those cosmetic fads Egyptians adored. Either way, you picture someone leaning closer, honey-scented and mischievous, whispering, "Another beer?" You keep moving, the streets narrowing, and suddenly you pass a painted doorway where music spills out, low, sultry tunes played on the lute. Inside, shadows sway. Are they dancing? Are they negotiating? You can't tell, but you do notice laughter, the kind that drips with both promise and mockery. And here's your first historical joke of the night. Somewhere in this same city, a scribe once doodled a monkey dressed as a priest flirting with a girl in a papyrus margin. Satirical graffiti has always existed. It seems boredom is timeless. You notice the juxtaposition. On one corner, a shrine to Hathor, goddess of love and music, decorated with fresh flowers. Just across, a windowless tavern where deals for the night are being struck. Sacred and profane standing shoulder to shoulder, not enemies, but uneasy neighbors. Egyptians didn't always separate devotion and desire, they often overlapped. Think of it as a city that understood life was messy. Your sandals crunch again, and you're drawn toward the river bank. A barge sways gently, torches lit, music and laughter drifting from the deck. A floating party? Yes, and more. Some wealthier clients preferred these mobile retreats where no nosy neighbors could watch. And here's the fringe tidbit: a Greek traveler once claimed to see water courts, barges used for more than feasting. Whether he exaggerated to amuse his audience back home, or whether the Nile truly hosted floating brothels, remains up for debate. Historians still argue whether such accounts were slander, fantasy, or a glimpse of genuine Egyptian nightlife. The air thickens with incense as you return through the alleys. Every corner reveals something new: women in bright linen veils walking in groups, giggling, men leaning against walls, sandals dusty, eyes searching, merchants carrying trays of beer jars. The streets hum with possibility. And you realize you've entered a world that isn't written in schoolbooks, yet it feels alive. Your guide through these shadows is the moonlight itself, catching on gold jewelry, glinting in coal-lined eyes. You imagine the secret codes: a tilted lamp at a doorway, a lotus painted on a lintel, a certain fragrance that means more than simple perfume. You remember the honey trick, and wonder if that's what you're smelling now. By the time you circle back toward the marketplace square, you've pieced together a portrait of Thebes not as a solemn relic but as a living, breathing place where trade and tenderness collided. The sacred temples and the hidden brothels were only walls apart. And you've walked right through the middle, feeling both the danger and the allure tug at your sleeve. You drift forward without stopping, your sandals still dusty from Thebes' night alleys, until suddenly the walls of the city grow taller, quieter, more solemn. The moonlight gleams now against massive pylons carved with hieroglyphs and scenes of kings smiting enemies, a dramatic backdrop for what, strangely enough, was also a place of very human intimacy. You're standing before one of the great temples, maybe Karnak or Luxor, and the incense is heavy in the air, curling like ghostly fingers around carved columns. You expect silence, solemn chanting, priests shuffling in linen robes, but instead you catch a strain of music, a drumbeat, a laugh. Sacred space, yes, but also something else entirely. Because here's the twist: temples weren't just centers of worship. They were also magnets for gatherings, performances, and sometimes for whispered encounters that blurred the line between devotion and desire. You can almost hear the temple walls chuckling at their double life. The mainstream fact: many Egyptian temples honored Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, and music, whose cult often involved festivals where dancing and singing weren't just permitted, they were celebrated. Women known as musicians of Hathor, or chantresses, served inside, offering music that was both spiritual and sensual. Their performances stirred crowds to ecstasy, and though technically religious, the atmosphere left plenty of room for sparks between attendees. You picture a crowd swaying with sistrums, those rattling instruments shaped like tiny gateways, chanting praises that sound suspiciously like party songs. Now comes the quirky tidbit. Some ancient sources hint that the line between temple entertainers and companions for hire was very thin. Imagine, a pilgrim comes to offer prayers, and instead finds himself swept into a circle of dancers, one of whom might slip away with him after the ritual. Was it worship? Was it a transaction? Or both? Historians still argue whether these temple-associated women were priestesses, courtesans, or simply performers whose reputations blurred in the gossip of later writers. And then you stumble across a more curious detail: the festival of drunkenness. No, that's not me exaggerating. At temples of Hathor and Mut, entire crowds drank themselves to the edge of collapse, reenacting the myth where the goddess Sekhmet was pacified by red beer disguised as blood. The festival was rowdy, emotional, and yes, full of opportunities for fleeting companionship. You imagine the temple courtyard sloshing with beer jars, someone playing a lute off-key, laughter rising louder than the chants of priests. You can feel yourself smirking now, sacred space, but with the unmistakable scent of roasted goose wings, beer foam, and sweat of bodies pressed too close. And that joke you promised yourself, you realize ancient priests must have rolled their eyes at drunken pilgrims the way modern bartenders sigh when karaoke night gets out of hand. The temple's architecture suddenly looms again, columns painted in faint blues and reds. Above you, carvings of gods and kings watch in silence, and you can't help but think, did they approve of what went on here? Or did they simply accept that humans, being humans, will always turn devotion into a little party on the side? Now, think about this paradox, devotion and desire in the same courtyard. For some, the intimacy that unfolded here was worship. To be embraced under the eyes of Hathor wasn't sacrilege, it was literally a prayer in flesh and laughter. For others, it was scandalous, the kind of thing scribes scribbled about with veiled sarcasm. One papyrus even depicts women offering their bodies in temples, though whether that's a factual record or moral satire remains fiercely debated. Historians still argue whether such papyri reflect reality, propaganda, or just the ancient equivalent of tabloid gossip. You let the incense sting your nose and move deeper into the temple complex. Shadows of statues stretch across polished floors, and you hear faint whispers tucked into alcoves. Was it prayer? A confession? Or maybe just someone making a deal they didn't want their neighbors to overhear? Picture it, at the very heart of religion, where gods were fed with offerings of bread and beer, humans also sought their own nourishment, less spiritual and more earthly. And perhaps, in their minds, the gods were fine with it. After all, what is love, what is passion, if not one of the divine gifts? And there's another playful image. Archaeologists have found graffiti inside temple walls, sometimes obscene, sometimes comic. Imagine a young apprentice scribe sneaking into a quiet chamber, scratching out a joke about his superior, two stick figures doing something very much not religious, then slipping away before the priests notice. Sacred and profane, forever cheek to cheek. As you step back out into the cool night air, you feel both awed and amused. The temple's stone bulk looms behind you, a reminder that in Egypt, nothing was ever just one thing. Temples were grand houses of the gods, yes, but also stages, taverns, and meeting places where life, messy and human, spilled through the cracks of ritual. You can still hear the drumbeat echoing in your chest, a rhythm that's equal parts hymn and dance tune. And as you walk away toward the next street, the moonlight glances off the Nile, as if winking at you, saying, "See? Nothing is ever as simple as it looks." Perfume hits your nose first. Not the kind that feels like someone sprayed an entire mall sample at once, but a rich, honey-thick aroma of lotus, cinnamon, and maybe a little frankincense wafting through the warm Egyptian air. You've left the temple shadows behind, and now you're winding through a district where cosmetics shops and wig stalls cluster like neon signs in a modern city's nightlife strip. If you think the ancient Egyptians were stiff desert dwellers with sand in their sandals, oh no, friend, they were the beauty influencers of the Bronze Age. You pass a workshop where a woman is grinding malachite on a stone slab, mixing it into a green coal paste. She's humming while carefully filling a tiny alabaster jar, ready to paint eyelids until they look like they belong to gods. Egyptians loved their eyes so dark and bold they seemed to glow in moonlight. And of course, you can't help but think, was this only for ritual purity? Or maybe also because a little eyeliner goes a long way when you're trying to catch someone's attention at the beer house. Here's your mainstream fact: cosmetics in Egypt weren't just vanity, they were medical too. Kohl around the eyes actually protected against harsh sun glare and maybe even infection. Practical, protective, and pretty. That's a triple win. Now here's the quirky tidbit that makes you smile. Wigs weren't just fashion accessories, they were whole social statements. Made of human hair, sheep's wool, or plant fibers, they came perfumed with oils and stuffed with fresh flowers for big occasions. Imagine you're meeting someone at the tavern. You show up wearing not your everyday sand-blown wig, but your Saturday night lotus-scented deluxe wig, carefully oiled and maybe even glued down with resin so it doesn't fly off mid-dance. That's commitment to style. Historians still argue whether these wigs were mostly about hygiene, since shaving your head helped with lice, or status signaling, or both. But as you breathe in the mingled scent of perfumed wigs and flower garlands, you know one thing: in this city, beauty wasn't optional, it was survival. You notice men dipping reed brushes into tiny jars of perfume, slicking oil onto their beards. Women smear red ochre onto lips and cheeks, then dab honey along their wrists like a sticky little bracelet. Honey again. Remember the honey lips from the night streets of Thebes? Seems Egypt had a sweet tooth not just for food but for seduction too. And here comes your first little joke of this section. You imagine an ancient couple waking up stuck together because someone went a little too heavy with the honey lip gloss. Awkward silence. One mutters, "Well, guess we're married now." But beauty wasn't always soft. Some recipes used crocodile dung as a skin treatment. Yeah, you heard that right. Crocodile dung. Ground up, dried, mixed with oils, smeared on the face. Historians still argue whether that was genuinely believed to prevent wrinkles or just another cosmetic fad gone horribly wrong. Either way, you suddenly feel better about your overpriced moisturizer back home. Perfume cones catch your eye next. Little cones of scented fat perched right on top of wigs, slowly melting in the heat, releasing waves of fragrance as the night went on. Romantic. Yes. Practical. Not at all. You picture yourself dancing at a festival, the cone dripping like a candle, sliding down your cheek as you try to flirt. Still, Egyptians loved them. Maybe because in a crowded beer house, smelling like lotus instead of sweat was worth every greasy drip. The streets echo with chatter. A group of musicians laugh as they smear on eyeliner. A woman checks her reflection in a polished copper mirror, tilting her head, adjusting her wig. Two children chase each other with flower garlands, squealing, scattering petals. Everywhere you turn, beauty is not just for nobility, it's for everyone who can scrape together a little copper for ochre, or a sprig of herbs to scent their hair. And then, you pass a small shrine dedicated to Hathor again. Offerings of mirrors, perfume bottles, and combs are piled up at her feet. That's when it clicks. Beauty here isn't superficial. It's devotion. Looking radiant isn't just to please others, it's to honor the gods, to embody their ideals. But if that divine eyeliner also helps you catch someone's eye across a tavern table, well, that's just bonus. You keep walking and your imagination runs wild. The wig stalls as the ancient equivalent of a trendy barber shop, full of gossip and laughter. Perfume vendors as influencers, hyping up the newest lotus blend. And the honey-smeared lips as, let's be honest, a bold pickup move. As the night deepens, you breathe in the scents swirling through the street. Cinnamon, lotus, frankincense, and yes, a faint whiff of crocodile dung from a stall you do not linger near. You shake your head, smiling. In Egypt, beauty wasn't optional, it was a performance. And every performer needed the right costume, wig, kohl, perfume, honey gloss, to play their part under the watchful eyes of gods and neighbors alike. You carry the scent of honey and coal in your nose as the street bends back toward the hum of the marketplace. The lanterns are dim now, flickering against walls, and the air carries not just perfume but the sharper smell of barley beer and roasted onions. The night has shifted. You've gone from the glamour of wigs and cosmetics to the raw reality of survival. Because behind every smile, every wig adjusted just so, there's one question pulsing like the Nile itself: what's the price of desire? Coins jingle softly in a merchant's hand. But wait, coins weren't the real deal in most of Egypt's long history. Barter ruled. A loaf of bread, a jug of beer, a linen tunic, a little basket of fish. These were the currencies of love and transaction. You wander past a stall where a woman haggles loudly, not for onions or garlic, but for her evening companionship. Payment isn't a pile of silver drachmas, but 2 jars of beer and a side of roasted goose. Sounds like a picnic, but it's actually the exchange rate of the night. Here's your mainstream fact: in Egypt, labor of all kinds was often paid in rations rather than coins. Bread, beer, and clothing were standard. That extended into shadowy trades too. A night's companionship might mean a week of grain for your family, or a new pair of sandals. The economy of intimacy was woven right into the same system that built pyramids and temples. And the quirky tidbit: archaeologists found ostraca, little shards of pottery used as notepads, scribbled with receipts for beer and other services. Imagine keeping a tab at the local tavern, written on a broken pot, your name and charges jotted for the scribe to chuckle at later. 2 jars of beer, 1 loaf of bread, 1, private evening. Not exactly discreet, but practical. Historians still argue whether these ostraca were genuine records of transactions, or jokes between scribes poking fun at each other's habits. Was it satire? Was it bookkeeping? Or was it, like most human things, a little of both? You pass a man staggering slightly, clutching a goose under one arm like it's treasure. He grins sheepishly at a veiled woman waiting by a doorway. Payment in poultry, romance at its finest. You can't help but laugh. It's the ancient equivalent of showing up to a date with a giant bag of groceries. Smooth move, sir. And then, in richer neighborhoods, the payments rise. Gold bangles, amulets, jars of imported wine. Courtesans of higher rank didn't settle for bread or beer. They expected gifts that shouted wealth and power. Picture a nobleman sliding a necklace of carnelian across a dancer's palm, the stones glowing in firelight, sealing the deal. These transactions blurred into patronage, companionship, politics. Were they lovers? Partners? Or just mutually beneficial allies? The answer depends on who's writing the papyrus. You wander past a small courtyard where laughter rings louder than the cicadas. A group of workers gamble with knuckle bones, the stakes not just beer but favors owed, debts to be paid in more private ways. You lean on the wall, watching, and realize desire here was both a currency and a gamble. You might trade a jug of beer for a night, but you might also lose your week's rations chasing something you can't afford. And here's your joke: imagine explaining to your boss at the temple that you're late on your quota of bricks because you spent all your barley beer on festivities. The look on his face would probably mirror any modern HR manager's, unimpressed but secretly curious. The more you look, the clearer it becomes. The economics of desire were never separate from survival. A poor woman might use companionship as her only means of supporting children. A wealthy man might flaunt gifts as a public show of his power. Everyone knew the system. Everyone played their part. And the Nile kept flowing, as steady as the exchanges happening in its shadow. You pause by the riverbank where a fisherman mends his net. He glances up, offers you a smile, and points toward the tavern across the street. You follow his gaze and see another exchange playing out, a woman laughing, clinking a jar of beer against a man's, sliding into the shadows with him. No paperwork needed. No ledger required. Just a simple deal, desire for sustenance, companionship for survival. And as you step back into the street, you realize, in ancient Egypt, love and lust were never free. They were measured in loaves, jars, bangles, and birds. And you can't help but grin, wondering what your currency would have been. A goose? A honey pot? Or maybe just a good story to trade in the marketplace tomorrow morning. The market air still clings to you, the scent of onions, beer, and honey, when the mood shifts again. Because as you walk past the dim torches and quieter houses, you notice accents. Not Egyptian. You catch a word of Greek, a murmur in Nubian, laughter in a dialect you don't even recognize. Suddenly the streets feel bigger, more like a crossroads than a city. And you realize Egypt wasn't just Egyptian. It was the Vegas of the ancient world, pulling in travelers, traders, and yes, foreigners looking for both adventure and companionship. The Nile was the great artery of empire. Every ship that docked brought grain, gold, linen, incense, and people. And where there are travelers, there are stories and transactions. Picture a Greek sailor stumbling into Thebes, dazzled by women with painted eyes and scented wigs. He doesn't speak the language, but coins, or amphorae of wine, speak loud enough. Here's your mainstream fact: foreigners were a constant in Egypt. Nubians, Libyans, Syrians, Greeks, and later Persians and Romans all mingled in the cities, often working as mercenaries, merchants, or envoys. Their presence added new tastes, new fashions, and inevitably, new customers for Egypt's shadowy trades. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Greek writers, always eager for a juicy story, claimed Egyptian women were famously open with foreign men. One tale describes courtesans along the Nile who supposedly auctioned their favors to sailors, each transaction like a public show. Is it true? Or was it just Greeks projecting their fantasies onto exotic Egypt? Historians still argue whether these tales are exaggerated slander, playful gossip, or actual eyewitness accounts. But you can almost hear the sailors boasting back in Athens, "You haven't lived until you've seen the girls by the Nile." You follow the sound of pipes and tambourines to a courtyard lit with foreign lamps. Inside, merchants from Phoenicia sip beer, their hands heavy with rings. A pair of Egyptian dancers twirl in linen skirts, anklets jingling, hair wigs scented with myrrh. Negotiations are happening in gestures and glances, more universal than words. The merchants toss out amulets carved from carnelian, trinkets from far-off lands, and the dancers laugh, pretending not to be impressed. But the deal is already sealed in the way they lean close. And then, you overhear a more political flavor. A Nubian envoy, cloaked in leopard skin, walks proudly with an Egyptian companion at his side. She isn't just company, she's a statement, a symbol of alliance. Courtesans of higher class weren't merely entertainers. They could carry whispers of diplomacy from pillow to throne. Imagine the pharaoh himself inviting a foreign dignitary to enjoy the city's finest hospitality as a gesture of goodwill. Now your joke sneaks in. Picture the awkward moment when the envoy tries to pay with an elephant tusk, and the poor tavern owner mutters, "Sir, we don't have storage for that." A goat or goose would have been simpler. You wander deeper into the foreign quarter, where graffiti marks the walls in Greek letters alongside hieroglyphs. Some are just names, some are crude sketches. Humans haven't changed much. You picture a tipsy Greek sailor scratching his name beside a drawing of a voluptuous figure, proud to leave proof of his adventures. Little did he know, 2,000 years later, archaeologists would shake their heads at his art. But it wasn't always light-hearted. Foreigners sometimes disrupted the balance. Locals grumbled about outsiders stealing women's time or inflating the market with foreign silver. And the relationships weren't always equal. Some Egyptian women, desperate, might have been pulled into situations where their choice wasn't much of one. The economy of intimacy could be cruel when power was uneven. Still, the Nile nights kept flowing with laughter, music, and mingled accents. You imagine a table of men, an Egyptian scribe, a Syrian trader, a Greek mercenary, clinking jars of beer, joking in broken phrases, sharing the company of the same dancer who navigates their languages with the universal currency of wit and smile. The city feels like a melting pot, ancient and familiar. Foreigners brought spice, novelty, and tension. Egyptians responded with curiosity, caution, and sometimes, opportunity. And as you leave the courtyard, the river's surface reflects not just the moon, but the mingling of worlds, Egyptian, Nubian, Greek, all drawn together by desire and trade under the same silver sky. Your footsteps guide you away from the foreign quarter, where Greek sailors still laugh over their amphorae, and toward a rowdier sound, clapping, flutes, the sharp plunk-plunk of a lute string that's been tuned just enough to keep the rhythm. The smell hits you next, yeasty beer, sour and sweet at the same time, spilling from clay jugs. Then roasted tilapia, sizzling goat fat, a whiff of spilled wine. Welcome to the taverns, friend, the true engines of Egypt's nightlife, where beer, wine, and wild nights tangle together with companionship in ways both hilarious and haunting. The tavern door hangs open, a torch flickering in the breeze. Inside, benches are crowded with workers in rough linen tunics, soldiers with scarred arms, and women in wigs laughing louder than anyone else. Clay jars thump onto tables, foaming with beer brewed from barley. And yes, this isn't some delicate chalice. We're talking big jars you scoop from with reeds like a straw. It's messy, it's communal, it's Egypt's happy hour. Mainstream fact, beer wasn't just a luxury, it was a staple of the Egyptian diet. Everyone drank it, children, priests, workers on pyramid crews. It was thick, almost porridge-like, and rich in nutrients. So naturally, taverns doubled as both eateries and meeting places for deals, gossip, and after-dark arrangements. Now the quirky tidbit, some taverns weren't just casual hangouts, they had reputations as houses of beer where you didn't just get a drink, you got company. In fact, a surviving papyrus poem hints at tavern girls with eyes that catch and a door that never closes. You can almost picture it, a drunk farmer wandering in, greeted by a woman with a jug in one hand and a suggestive smile in the other. Historians still argue whether these taverns were openly known as brothels, or whether companionship was just an unofficial side business. Were they licensed, tolerated, or ignored? No clear answer survives, but the walls of these beer houses must have seen more secrets than any temple. You squeeze onto a bench beside a scribe who's clearly had one too many reeds of beer. He leans in, breath heavy, slurring, best dancers in the city, right here. He points toward the open floor where two women twirl to the beat of drums, anklets jingling, wigs glistening with perfumed oil. Men cheer, women laugh, and a little boy sneaks through the crowd selling roasted onions on sticks. Egypt's nightlife had room for everyone. Now here's your first joke. Imagine trying to flirt gracefully while drinking beer gruel through a straw with breadcrumbs floating in it. Nothing says romantic like slurping barley paste. But taverns didn't just serve beer, they also had wine. Imported from Syria, Canaan, and later Greece, wine was expensive, exotic, and often mixed with honey or herbs. Ordering wine instead of beer marked you as wealthy, sophisticated, maybe even foreign. And naturally, the dancers and courtesans noticed. A jar of wine could buy more than a night's drink, it could buy the kind of attention that lasted until sunrise. The tavern walls are alive with graffiti, scratched in by drunken hands. You spot crude drawings of animals, bawdy stick figures, jokes about priests who couldn't handle their drink. Archaeologists have found exactly this sort of thing in places like Deir al-Medina, where workmen carved cheeky jokes onto ostraca after one too many beers. Apparently, nothing bonds people like alcohol and questionable humor. Another mainstream detail comes alive as you notice the music swelling. Harps, lutes, clapping, voices raised in rhythmic chants. Music and alcohol were inseparable, part of Egypt's festivals, taverns, even funerary rituals. And here in the tavern, they fuel the heat of the night. One corner catches your eye, a small table where a wealthy merchant sits with 3 women draped in linen finer than the crowd around them. They pour his wine, laugh at his jokes, lean close to whisper. He pays not just in coin or gifts but in the performance of wealth, displaying how much he can spend in one evening. Companionship here isn't just about intimacy, it's about status, spectacle, and being seen. Your second joke sneaks in, imagine the ancient equivalent of a bar tab. Some poor guy stumbles home, ostracon in hand, muttering, "Wait. I owe how many geese?" But not everything was laughter. The taverns had darker corners too. Drunken fights broke out, debts spiraled, diseases spread. The very same place that glittered with perfume and music could also ruin a life overnight. It's the timeless contradiction of nightlife, joy and risk, side by side. Still, as the night stretches on, you can't help but be swept up. The rhythm of clapping, the smell of roasted goat, the foam on the beer jar. A dancer winks, a scribe snores, a merchant throws his head back in laughter. And through it all, you realize Egypt's taverns weren't just about drinking. They were about connection. People searching for warmth, release, distraction, or a fleeting illusion of love, all under the same smoke-darkened roof. And as you step outside into the cooler night, the noise fading behind you, the Nile's reflection shimmers. Beer, wine, music, companionship, they were all currencies of the same hunger, to feel alive, even if only until sunrise. The tavern's laughter fades behind you, but the rhythm lingers, a drumbeat, a clatter of sistrums, the faint hum of a lute string. You follow it through the quiet streets until you reach a courtyard where torches burn low and people are gathered in a circle. Not for drinking this time, not for dice games or brawls. They're listening. And at the center stands a harpist, plucking strings that ripple like the Nile under moonlight. You sink onto a worn stone bench, and instantly the air feels different, softer, charged with something you can't quite name. The harpist leans close to her instrument, sings in a low, lilting voice, and suddenly you're transported. These are not hymns to gods. These are love songs. Desire songs. Poems carved into melody that make the crowd laugh, sigh, and blush in equal measure. Mainstream fact, ancient Egyptian poetry, especially from the New Kingdom, is filled with romantic and erotic imagery. The so-called love songs, preserved on papyri and ostraca, describe longing, passion, and playful seduction in words that still sound modern. Lines like, "I want to be your shirt so I may embrace your body," or "Your love intoxicates me more than wine," give you the sense that the harpist is simply performing an ancient Spotify playlist of crush anthems. Now the quirky tidbit. These songs weren't always sung in courtly halls. Evidence suggests they were performed in taverns, gardens, or even during festivals, settings where subtle erotic jokes and wordplay could flow as freely as the beer. Imagine a harpist strumming a cheeky verse about figs or fish, both, by the way, were ancient symbols of fertility, while the crowd roared with laughter. Historians still argue whether some of the bawdier lines were part of official poetry or just improvisations by clever performers trying to earn an extra jug of beer. You lean closer, and the harpist sings a verse about a girl longing for her lover's embrace, her words wrapped in metaphors of lotus blossoms and honey jars. The crowd chuckles knowingly, each person picturing their own secret rendezvous. Someone behind you mutters, "Sounds like my wife." Everyone laughs. Here's your first joke of the night. Imagine explaining to your modern music teacher that your ancient homework was a love song comparing your crush to a goose stew. Try turning that in for extra credit. The harpist changes tempo now, faster, teasing, her fingers darting over strings. The lyrics turn playful, poking fun at shy lovers, mocking men who boast too much, or girls who leave their suitors waiting all day outside their door. The audience claps along, some blushing, some shouting witty comebacks. You realize, this isn't just entertainment. It's therapy. A safe space where everyone can laugh at love's absurdities, release their frustrations, and feel, for a moment, less alone. In the shadows you notice another detail. Scribes sit quietly, jotting lines onto ostraca, preserving these verses for posterity. Maybe they're collecting them as high art. Maybe they're just recording the night's funniest punchlines. Either way, without those scribbles, we'd never know how Egyptians joked and dreamed about love. The harpist pauses, letting the strings hum. She closes with a softer song, one not about laughter but about longing, two lovers separated by distance, dreaming of each other across the Nile. The courtyard goes still. Even the drunks at the back lean forward, silent. In that moment, you feel the centuries collapse. Love songs from 3,000 years ago sound just like the ones you'd hear on the radio today. Different words, different instruments, but the same ache, the same thrill. Your second joke slides in gently. You picture a young Egyptian scribbling a love poem on a potsherd, handing it nervously to his crush. She reads it, sighs, and uses the shard to scrape honey from a jar instead. Romance denied. The performance ends. The crowd scatters, some still humming, some sneaking into the shadows with companions stirred by the music. You stand slowly, the harp's notes still buzzing in your ears. It wasn't just a concert. It was a reminder that desire, longing, and laughter have always been sung aloud, shared in courtyards, whispered across the ages. As you walk back toward the Nile, you realize the songs of the harpists weren't just entertainment. They were maps of the human heart, funny, messy, desperate, and true. And the night feels warmer because of it. The echo of the harp strings fades, but you don't drift back toward the noisy taverns this time. Instead, your steps carry you to a quieter district, wider streets, larger houses with painted shutters, gardens that spill the scent of jasmine into the night. Here the air is different. It doesn't smell of beer foam and sweat, it smells of polished cedar and imported myrrh. This is where power lives. And in these streets, you find a different kind of companion, not the tavern girl laughing over a jar of beer, but the courtesans of the Nile. You imagine them moving gracefully through these gardens, wigs heavy with gold beads, linen gowns nearly transparent in the torchlight. Their laughter is softer, rehearsed. Their words are sharper, chosen. Because here, companionship isn't a quick exchange of bread and beer, it's a currency of influence, politics, and survival. Here's your mainstream fact: high-status women existed in Egyptian society who weren't wives, priestesses, or queens, but companions whose roles blended performance, intimacy, and diplomacy. They appear in papyri as singers, dancers, or concubines, often linked to noble households or even to Pharaoh himself. Their presence wasn't hidden in shame. They could attend feasts, festivals, even appear in art, their influence reaching into the heart of court life. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some courtesans were so famous that their names were preserved, whispered across centuries. One tale mentions a woman whose wit and charm won her patronage from multiple noblemen, each trying to outdo the other with lavish gifts, jewelry, chariots, exotic pets. Imagine rolling up to a dinner date with a baboon on a leash just to show off. Somewhere in the background, you can hear the baboon screeching, not impressed. Historians still argue whether these women were closer to concubines, entertainers, or political agents, yet all agree they wielded more influence than a casual glance might suggest. You slip into the memory of a banquet hall. The air shimmers with lamp smoke, music rises from harps and flutes, and courtesans weep between couches where nobles recline, pouring wine, whispering secrets. One leans close to a general, laughing at his joke, but maybe slipping a question into his ear that changes how tomorrow's campaign will be planned. Another sits beside a priest, fingers brushing an amulet on his chest, perhaps coaxing a prophecy out of him. Desire and politics are braided so tightly here you can't see the seam. Your first joke surfaces. You picture a pharaoh boasting that he's conquered Nubia, only for his courtesan to smirk and reply, "Darling, I conquered you with just a smile." Who really won that battle? These courtesans weren't just companions, they were symbols. A noble hosting a feast would display his favorite courtesans as proof of his wealth and refinement. To be seen in their company was to signal taste and power. And yet, beneath the surface, these women could shape decisions, tilt alliances, and alter history. After all, secrets whispered in silk-draped bedrooms had a way of traveling further than edicts carved in stone. There's another quirky twist. Some of these women became associated with religious roles, particularly in cults of Hathor and Isis. They weren't just entertainers, they embodied divine femininity. To embrace one was, in a way, to commune with the goddess herself. Was it devotion? Was it desire? Historians still argue whether the overlap was sacred duty or just poetic spin. Either way, the men didn't seem to mind. You wander past a villa gate and overhear voices inside, a wealthy merchant boasting about his ships, a courtesan responding with a clever joke that makes the entire hall erupt in laughter. You don't need to see her face to know she has the room wrapped around her little finger. Influence, disguised as entertainment. Your second joke sneaks in. Imagine the ancient version of influencers. Courtesans were basically Instagram stars of their day, curated appearances, witty banter, luxury gifts showered on them by admirers. The only difference? Instead of filters, they had perfume cones slowly melting on their wigs. By the time you circle back toward the Nile, the torches of these wealthy villas flicker behind you. You think of the courtesans still inside, reclining on cushions, sipping sweet wine, weaving influence into every laugh and glance. They weren't queens, yet they could sway kings. They weren't priests, yet they carried the aura of the divine. And you realize, the courtesans of the Nile weren't just shadows in the margins of history. They were players on the stage, shaping love, politics, and even destiny. And though their names are mostly lost, their echoes ripple like moonlight across the river, reminding you that power often hides in silk and laughter. The villas and perfumed gardens fade behind you, their laughter replaced by something sharper, the steady crunch of your footsteps against clay dust as you drift toward the temple precincts. Here, torches burn with steadier discipline, and the night air carries incense, not beer foam. The Nile seems quieter on this side of the city, as though even the river hushes when you step into sacred ground. And this is where you sense it, the overlap of desire and divinity. Because Egypt didn't draw a hard line between body and spirit. Love, pleasure, fertility, they all had their gods, their rituals, their mysteries. Mainstream fact first, Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy, was central to Egyptian life. She was called Mistress of the West, Lady of Drunkenness, and even Hand of Atom. Festivals in her honor were filled with music, dance, wine, and yes, intimacy. Her temples sometimes hosted women whose roles weren't just sacred chants and offerings, but physical expressions of devotion. Imagine a whole city dancing, drinking, and embracing under her blessing. It wasn't considered scandal, it was cosmic harmony. Now the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found little votive figurines, tiny clay models of women with exaggerated features, some holding mirrors, some with hair arranged like festival wigs. Were they offerings to Hathor? Playful fertility charms? Or ancient equivalents of novelty souvenirs from the temple gift shop? Historians still argue whether these figurines were acts of personal devotion or cheeky jokes bought after a festival binge. You can almost picture a tipsy pilgrim stumbling home with one tucked under his arm like, "Don't worry, darling, I brought you a sacred Hathor doll." You pause near a columned hall where musicians are still plucking at strings. Tonight's celebration has a looseness, a wild edge. Young men and women drink together, eyes sparkling, as priests lift jars of wine to the goddess. A woman, maybe a temple entertainer, maybe a priestess, laughs as she pours wine, then sings a verse praising Hathor as she who fills hearts with joy. The crowd answers with cheers. This is where things blur. Were these women courtesans in disguise, or priestesses performing sacred duties? The record is hazy. Some texts describe women of the temple who served Hathor through dance, music, and companionship. Others hint that these roles carried intimacy that was considered holy, not profane. Historians still argue whether such rituals truly involved physical unions or if that's a misreading of poetic metaphors. Either way, the goddess of love was no abstract idea. She was alive in the touch of dancers, in the perfume on their skin, in the laughter spilling out of temple gates at midnight. Here's your first joke. Imagine being a young priest assigned temple cleanup duty the morning after a Hathor festival. "Sweep the floor," they said. "Light the incense," they said. Nobody mentioned picking up 300 empty beer jars and one lost sandal shaped like a fish. But devotion wasn't always indulgence. The cult of Isis added another dimension. As goddess of magic, motherhood, and resurrection, she too absorbed the aura of love and desire. Pilgrims came seeking healing, fertility, or reunion with lost partners. Women prayed for children. Men prayed for virility. Couples prayed for enduring love. Some temple rituals involved whispering names of loved ones into sacred pools or leaving inscribed amulets shaped like wombs, phalluses, or hearts. Again, the physical and spiritual were twined like reeds in the Nile. You imagine walking into a smaller sanctuary at dawn, the candles nearly out. A young woman kneels before an image of Hathor, her offering a jar of scented oil. she whispers her lover's name into the clay, begging the goddess to soften his heart. Outside, you hear laughter and songs, but in this chamber the silence is weighted, tender, almost fragile. You realize, the sacred and the sensual were two sides of the same coin here. Your second joke slides in gently. You picture a worshipper carving a prayer onto a clay tablet, only to spell his lover's name wrong. Centuries later, an archaeologist finds it. "O mighty Hathor, bring me Bessie." Poor man. Wrong woman blessed. As you wander back into the temple court, dawn paints the columns pink. The music has quieted, the festival's chaos sinking into yawns and giggles, but the air still smells of wine and lotus. You understand now that to the Egyptians, love wasn't just private pleasure. It was divine, cyclical, written into the rhythm of gods and humans alike. And so the courtyards, taverns, and villas you've seen, messy, funny, human, aren't separate from the temples. They're part of the same current. Whether through a courtesan's laughter, a love song's verse, or a whispered prayer, the Egyptians believed desire was holy. And as the first rays of sunlight scatter across the temple walls, you can almost feel Hathor herself smiling at the revelers stumbling home, blessing them with joy, fertility, and one massive morning after headache. The temple steps fade behind you as dawn settles in, and with it comes a shift in tone. The wild laughter, the wine-sweet breath, the perfume smoke, all give way to the scratching of reed pens and the rustle of papyrus. Because as much as Egypt celebrated love and play, it also recorded it, in meticulous, sometimes scandalous detail. You drift into the world of scribes, archivists, and bureaucrats, people who couldn't resist writing everything down, even the gossip that probably should have stayed whispered in a tavern corner. Here's your mainstream fact: Egyptian papyri often preserved court cases, complaints, and bureaucratic notes, including those about women accused of inappropriate relationships, adultery, or unlicensed brothel activity. These records show that society officially tried to regulate behavior, even as festivals and daily life clearly blurred the lines. It's a reminder, every age has its paperwork, even for scandal. But the quirky tidbit is juicier. Archaeologists have uncovered satirical papyri, drawings and texts where animals act like humans, sometimes with shocking humor. A mouse leading cats as servants. A lion playing board games. A goose serenading a donkey. And yes, some sketches depicting men and women in cheeky, compromising positions. Were these scribes letting off steam after a long day of copying tax lists? Historians still argue whether these were private jokes, teaching tools, or even subtle political satire aimed at officials who acted like fools in love. You step into a scribe's chamber. The floor is littered with scraps of papyrus, some covered in neat hieratic script, others in doodles that would make modern schoolkids proud. A young scribe chuckles as he sketches a nobleman with donkey ears, his arm around a courtesan. Another apprentice shakes his head. If the overseer sees that, you're dead. But the doodle ends up tucked into a jar, surviving thousands of years, waiting to shock modern archaeologists into blushing. Your first joke comes naturally. Imagine a bored teenager in ancient Egypt, stuck in class learning hieroglyphs, secretly doodling stick figures kissing in the margins. Fast forward 3 millennia, and scholars call it an artifact of immense cultural significance. Somewhere that teen is laughing from the afterlife. But scandal wasn't confined to doodles. Papyrus records detail lawsuits, wives accusing husbands of neglect, neighbors tattling about secret lovers, officials prosecuting brothel keepers for cheating customers. One particularly spicy case describes a priest caught sneaking into a woman's house at night, only to claim he was checking on the household shrine. Historians still argue whether that excuse was sincere devotion, or just the oldest "I was only praying" defense in history. And here's where gossip seeps in. Letters between friends sometimes carry lines like, "Did you hear about so-and-so's daughter with the soldier?" Or, "They say the singer from the temple has been seen too often with the merchant's son." Gossip written in ink, preserved forever. You realize Egypt wasn't just pyramids and gods, it was also rumor mills and drama that would make reality TV jealous. Your second joke slides in with a smirk. Picture a scribe leaning over to his colleague, whispering, "Careful, if you write that down, people in 2025 are still going to be reading about her affair." The other scribe shrugs and keeps scribbling. Congratulations, your gossip history now. Some papyri are more tender. Love poems written in elegant script, tucked alongside tax records. A scribe pours his heart into verses about a woman's eyes, comparing them to lotus blossoms. Historians still argue whether these poems were personal confessions or training exercises for students learning to write flowery lines. Either way, they prove that passion had a place even in the bureaucratic heart of Egypt. You linger in a dusty archive room where a half-faded scroll lies open. The ink is brown, the words scratchy, but you can almost hear the voices: a complaint about stolen jewelry, a husband's plea for forgiveness, a bureaucrat's tally of brothel taxes. The mix is almost comical, romance and scandal weighed on the same scale as barley shipments. Your third joke bubbles up as you imagine a tax collector: one chicken for the state, one chicken for the temple, and yes, sir, that does include payment for last night's entertainment. Talk about awkward bookkeeping. As the day brightens and the scribes roll up their scrolls, you realize how much of Egypt's intimate world survives not through statues or temples, but through gossip, satire, and bureaucracy. Every doodle, every joke, every scandal scrawled on papyrus is a reminder that even in a civilization obsessed with eternity, people were still laughing, blushing, and whispering about who was sneaking where at night. And so, the ink-stained scrolls you leave behind aren't just relics, they're echoes of voices that sound suspiciously familiar. Because whether it's a 3,000-year-old doodle of a goose flirting with a donkey, or a modern meme on your phone, humans never stop mixing humor, scandal, and desire into the written record. The smell of ink and papyrus fades as you drift back outside, and the air feels heavier, thicker, as though you've stepped not into a festival, but into a clinic. Instead of songs, you hear coughing. Instead of laughter, whispered prayers for health. Because for all the glamour of perfume, music, and wine, there was another side to Egypt's sensual world: the risks, the dangers, the things nobody wanted to talk about but everybody had to face. Here's your mainstream fact: ancient Egyptian medical papyri, like the Ebers papyrus, around 1550 BCE, are some of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world. They include references to women's health, fertility treatments, and remedies for diseases of love. Doctors, priest-physicians, really did their best with the tools they had: honey, herbs, resins, and prayers. To them, illness wasn't just physical, it could also be spiritual, caused by angry gods or wandering spirits. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Some remedies sound less like medicine and more like bizarre kitchen experiments. Crocodile dung mixed with fermented dough, used, believe it or not, as a contraceptive. Garlic cloves inserted for the same purpose. Fumigation with incense to treat pelvic issues. Historians still argue whether these were genuinely believed effective or if they served more symbolic, ritual purposes. Imagine trusting your health to crocodile poop. No wonder people prayed to Hathor at the same time. You follow the sound of chanting and find yourself near a small medical shrine. A woman sits on a mat, clutching her stomach, while a healer prepares a poultice of honey and herbs. Honey really was their wonder drug. It had natural antibacterial qualities, though of course they didn't know the science behind it. They just knew it worked. The healer murmurs to the goddess Sekhmet, fierce deity of both plague and healing, asking her to protect the patient. Your first joke sneaks in, picture being the poor apprentice carrying jars of medical supplies. This one is honey, this one is garlic, and this one, oh great, guess who's on crocodile poop duty again? Some jobs just never get glamorous. But beyond laughter, the dangers were real. Close contact, crowded festivals, shared drinks, these spread disease. And while we don't have perfect records of what specific infections plagued courtesans and clients alike, Egyptian doctors were certainly aware that intimacy came with risks. The texts describe burning pains, sores, and mysterious fevers. Remedies ranged from poultices to incantations. Historians still argue whether these were early notes on sexually transmitted diseases, or whether scribes were lumping many unrelated ailments into the same vague categories. You wander further into the healer's house. Shelves are stacked with jars of resin, dried figs, lotus petals, and crushed malachite. A young man enters, embarrassed, asking for help. The healer doesn't judge, this is part of life. He scribbles a short spell on a scrap of linen, ties it around the patient's wrist, and hands him a paste of honey and ochre. Medicine, magic, and faith, all mixed in one. Your second joke pops up when you imagine an ancient patient whispering to a healer, "Please don't tell anyone about this." The healer nods solemnly, then immediately writes the symptoms in giant hieroglyphs on papyrus, where archaeologists will read them thousands of years later. Privacy? Sorry, not in eternity. Even birth carried risks tied to intimacy. Women who worked as entertainers or courtesans often faced pregnancy, sometimes unwanted, sometimes celebrated. Remedies promised to prevent conception, or ensure it. A woman might swallow a potion of acacia, dates, and honey. Another might wear an amulet shaped like the goddess Tauret, the hippo mother protector. Historians still argue whether these contraceptives had real chemical effects or were purely symbolic. Ironically, modern science has found that acacia fermentation produces a substance with spermicidal qualities. So maybe those old recipes weren't entirely superstition. You pause by a doorway where an older woman chants over a young one in labor. Drums beat softly in rhythm with her breath. Amulets clink around her neck. The whole room sways between science and magic, between herbs and prayers. You realize, disease and danger weren't just feared, they were woven into the same cycle of life and love that Egypt celebrated. And now your third joke, imagine a husband nervously pacing outside, asking the midwife, "Is everything okay?" The midwife, exhausted after hours, replies, "Yes, but if you don't stop pacing holes in my floor, I'll prescribe you a crocodile dung poultice." The risks didn't erase the joys. Egyptians faced them with resilience, with creativity, with humor. They believed that even pain had divine patterns, that illness could be soothed by gods as much as by garlic. And so every courtesan, every lover, every dancer knew, behind the music and perfume, there was always a shadow. Yet still they danced, still they loved, still they prayed. As night falls again, you leave the healer's house and step into the cool air. The stars blaze over the Nile, and you can almost hear the gods whisper, "Life is fragile, but it is also sacred." And that is why Egyptians faced danger not with silence, but with ritual, with laughter, and with hope. The night air softens again, and the stars overhead glow brighter, like pinpricks punched through a cosmic canopy. You've wandered past healers, scribes, and taverns, but now your path takes you upward, toward the sacred. Because in Egypt, passion wasn't just human, it was divine. To understand their world fully, you have to step into their myths, where goddesses themselves became models of love, attraction, and power. Here's your mainstream fact: Hathor and Isis were two of the most beloved deities in Egyptian religion, both deeply tied to love, fertility, beauty, and protection. Hathor, often depicted as a woman with cow horns holding a sun disk, was goddess of joy, music, dancing, and desire. Isis, wife of Osiris and mother of Horus, was revered as a goddess of magic, healing, and eternal devotion. Together, their stories shaped how Egyptians thought about intimacy, romance, and loyalty. And now the quirky tidbit. Ancient festivals dedicated to Hathor could get rowdy. Pilgrims traveled to her temple at Dendera, bringing music, beer, and songs. Some accounts suggest these celebrations blurred into outright carnivals of dancing, flirting, and wine drinking, almost like a divine-approved party for letting loose. Historians still argue whether these festivals formally included temple courtesans or if that detail is more rumor than fact, but either way, the vibe was indulgent, sensual, and filled with laughter. You walk into a temple courtyard bathed in moonlight. Harpists pluck delicate notes, women swirl with sistrums, those shaking musical rattles, and worshippers raise their cups. They sing songs to Hathor, goddess of love, asking her to bless unions, to ease heartbreak, to give fertility. You realize how seamlessly the sacred and the sensual merged, where modern minds might separate holy from playful. Egyptians saw no contradiction. Your first joke arrives as you imagine a priest trying to keep order. No, no, this is a religious festival, please stop dancing on the altar. But by the time he looks again, even the high priest is humming along to the music, swaying with a cup in hand. Isis, on the other hand, offered a different model, devotion mixed with power. Her most famous story? When her husband Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis scoured the land to collect his pieces. She found almost all of them, reassembled him, and through her magic brought him back, at least long enough to conceive Horus. Historians still argue whether this myth reflects older fertility rituals or was primarily political, reinforcing the pharaoh's divine right. But either way, it paints Isis as the ultimate partner, loyal, resourceful, and willing to defy death itself for love. You picture a priestess telling this story to a hushed crowd, the oil lamps flickering shadows across the temple walls. Every listener leans in, not just because it's about gods, but because it feels deeply human. Who hasn't wanted to pull someone back from loss? Who hasn't longed for love that conquers everything? Your second joke sneaks in as you imagine someone in the crowd muttering, "Wow, Isis found all of Osiris's body parts except one." Talk about awkward dinner conversation. And yet the myth turns even that missing piece into a symbol of fertility and magic. Egyptians had no problem mixing humor with reverence. Hathor and Isis weren't the only divine players. Bastet, goddess of cats, also carried associations with pleasure, music, and protective love. Sekhmet, fierce lioness, reminded everyone that passion could burn into destruction if uncontrolled. The pantheon itself was a balance, joy and danger, tenderness and fury. It reflected the same contradictions found in real-life relationships. You linger in the temple as worshippers offer flowers, milk, honey, and mirrors. Mirrors. Because in Egypt, mirrors weren't just vanity items, they were magical. Holding a polished bronze mirror could be like gazing into Hathor's eyes, inviting beauty and love into your life. Historians still argue whether mirrors had practical or purely symbolic power in rituals, but either way, you can feel the allure. Your third joke ripples through the crowd. Imagine a man nervously holding up his offering. This is for you, Hathor, goddess of beauty. His wife beside him clears her throat loudly. He quickly adds, and for you too, dearest. Marriage diplomacy, ancient style. As the night deepens, you realize how myths gave shape to ordinary lives. Courtesans might invoke Hathor for charm. Wives might pray to Isis for loyalty and healing. Dancers might rattle their sistrums in joy, believing they were part of the goddess's music. Every act of intimacy wasn't just physical, it was tied to the eternal dramas of gods and goddesses. And so, under the temple stars, the line between divine story and human experience blurs until you can't tell one from the other. Was a lover's devotion just personal? Or was it an echo of Isis saving Osiris? Was a festival dance just fun? Or was it Hathor herself swaying in the crowd? For Egyptians, the answer was always both. The temple lights dim in your memory, and you drift back out into the streets. The air feels lighter again, almost mischievous, as if the city itself wants to share a secret. Because not all stories were solemn or sacred, in fact, some were flat out funny. Egyptians had a wicked sense of humor, and they weren't afraid to carve it onto walls, scribble it on papyrus, or even laugh about subjects most societies considered taboo. Here's your mainstream fact: satire and humor were well documented in ancient Egypt. We found examples in papyri, in tomb drawings, and even in everyday graffiti. They reveal a culture that could be playful about politics, religion, and, yes, intimacy. For instance, the papyrus on Ostossi contains satirical instructions mocking incompetent scribes. The Turin erotic papyrus, around 1200 BCE, combines explicit scenes with cartoonish exaggeration, hinting at laughter rather than solemnity. And now the quirky tidbit. Ancient workers in Deir al-Medina sometimes scrawled graffiti of donkeys in compromising positions, or priests drawn as mice lording over cats. Imagine stumbling on that in a sacred tomb corridor. Historians still argue whether these were genuine acts of rebellion, or simply stress relief jokes among workers, like doodling cartoons on the office whiteboard. You pause by a crumbling wall along a side street. Torchlight flickers, revealing faint sketches, a tall, stern priest, with the ears of a donkey. Someone long ago had clearly mocked a figure of authority. You chuckle, because satire never ages. Egyptians may have bowed in temples, but in private they loved poking fun at leaders, gods, and each other. Your first joke takes shape here. Imagine the graffiti artist, crouched in the dark, whispering, "This will be hilarious in 3,000 years. Congratulations, buddy, it is." One of the most intriguing finds is the Turin erotic papyrus. This scroll, discovered in fragments, shows couples in exaggerated, often absurd scenarios, acrobatic poses, improbable contortions, sometimes paired with animals behaving like humans. Scholars debate endlessly about it. Was it a satirical jab at the elite? Was it light-hearted entertainment for private circles? Or was it a bawdy instruction manual? Historians still argue, but one thing is certain: it wasn't meant for solemn reading. You slip into the company of a group of artisans sharing beer after a long day. They sing ribald songs, clap along with drums, and tease each other. Their humor is earthy, direct, filled with innuendo. Even in a society of pharaohs and gods, people needed to laugh at the awkwardness of life. Your second joke springs naturally. Picture a serious young apprentice, trying to memorize hymns, when an older worker leans over and whispers, Careful, if you chant too fast, Hathor will think you're flirting. Cue the poor kid turning beet red while everyone laughs. Graffiti on tombs sometimes revealed playful defiance. Workers would carve notes like, "So-and-so was here, having a drink." Or they'd draw animals acting like humans, a lion serving beer, a mouse playing harp. These weren't random scribbles, they were reminders that humor was part of survival. The afterlife loomed large, but while living, people wanted to laugh. Even sacred rituals carried subtle satire. In certain festivals, masks were worn that exaggerated features, big noses, comically round eyes, like a divine stand-up act. Scholars wonder if these performances gave safe outlets for tension, letting communities laugh at themselves, their leaders, or even their gods, without truly offending them. Your third joke slides in here. Imagine a priest slipping into a festival mask with a goofy grin carved on it. "This is very serious religious business," he insists, while everyone in the crowd giggles at his oversized donkey ears. And sometimes the humor was downright cheeky. Erotic poetry itself could be playful, full of double meanings. A lotus might be a flower, or not. A fish swimming might just be dinner, or maybe not. Audiences knew the code, and the laughter was part of the fun. As you stroll past another wall, you find faint scribbles of stick figures locked in silly embraces. The artist wasn't trying to scandalize anyone, they were just joking, just like someone doodling in a modern classroom. Across millennia, humor about intimacy stays strangely the same. What's striking is that Egyptians didn't treat humor as unworthy of preservation. They carved it, painted it, copied it. Satire was not rebellion alone, it was part of life's rhythm. Sacredness and silliness coexisted, like two sides of the same coin. Even in their tombs, they wanted future generations, and maybe the gods themselves, to know they could laugh. The night closes around you with a softer smile. You realize you've walked through markets, temples, courts, and clinics, but here, on these walls, are the chuckles, the winks, the belly laughs of ordinary people. And maybe that's the greatest intimacy of all, to know that even thousands of years ago, someone snuck a joke onto the wall, hoping to make you laugh. And you did. The laughter of graffiti fades behind you, and the tone shifts again. The cobblestones under your feet feel heavier, the torches dimmer. Because now, Egypt is no longer just Egypt, it's Rome's Egypt. A world once ruled by pharaohs and priests now bends beneath the Roman eagle. And with this new order comes a reshaping of everything, including the traits of intimacy, companionship, and desire. Here's your mainstream fact: after Egypt became a province of Rome in 30 BCE, daily life, economy, and even morality began to shift. Roman law overlaid Egyptian customs, creating hybrids. Brothels continued, taverns thrived, but the regulation of sex work became more codified. Prostitutes were registered, taxed, and placed into strict legal categories. What once had been semi-sacred or fluid in Egyptian culture was forced into Roman bureaucracy. And now for the quirky tidbit. In some papyri, we see contracts drawn up between clients and companions, almost like receipts. One surviving document even mentions a price in 2 drachmas of silver for a night. It's oddly mundane, almost office-like in tone, as though passion itself had to be filed in triplicate. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or rare record-keeping, but the paperwork suggests Rome's love of control extended even to the bedroom. You walk into a tavern in Alexandria. The Greek columns are still there, but now busts of emperors glare down from alcoves. Laughter rings out, wine flows, but the tone feels different, more transactional, less mystical. The courtesans are still skilled, still witty, but their status has been reduced. Once they could claim ties to Hathor, or invoke Isis's magic. Now they are meretrices in Roman lists, taxed like cattle, controlled like property. Your first joke lightens the scene. Picture a Roman tax collector showing up with his scroll, "Sorry, miss, but we're short 1 drachma from last month's ledger." Even bureaucracy can kill the mood. Some companions adapted brilliantly. Alexandria, with its cosmopolitan swirl of Greeks, Jews, Romans, and Egyptians, became a hub where high-class courtesans could trade not only intimacy but also information. Some became spies, couriers of secrets between generals, governors, even rival emperors. There's always power in listening, and in whispering the right word to the right ear. Still, the vibrancy of Egypt's sensual culture dimmed. Festivals once wild with Hathor's laughter became tamer under Roman eyes. Licenses replaced libations. What was once sacred joy became taxable vice. Historians still argue whether this decline was total or whether underground traditions continued quietly in villages far from Roman centers. Perhaps, in the countryside, people still danced for Hathor, still whispered her name at night. You linger on one peculiar Roman-Egyptian blend, the Hathor of Alexandria, who adopted Greek and Roman fashions but kept Egyptian perfumes, music, and wit. They became cultural chameleons, dazzling poets and scholars alike. Some Roman writers even mocked Alexandria for its corrupting charms, which of course only made the city more famous as a place of indulgence. Your second joke bubbles up here, a stiff Roman senator visiting Alexandria, muttering, "I'm only here to inspect the grain supply," while sneaking out of a perfumed courtyard at sunrise. Yeah, sure, Senator. The medical risks, too, grew under Roman oversight. Prostitution was tolerated, but not protected. Diseases spread, remedies faltered. Physicians recorded treatments involving vinegar washes, strange ointments, and magical spells. Some scholars debate whether these cures came from Egyptian traditions or Roman imports, but either way, they reveal how fragile the trade had become when stripped of its sacred shield. Even religion bent to Rome. Isis remained beloved, worshipped not only in Egypt but across the empire, from Pompeii to London. Her image survived, but her role shifted. No longer was she the model for devotion and magic in companionship. Instead, she became a goddess of sailors, of mystery cults, of afterlife salvation. The intimate side of her story faded in official worship, though perhaps not in private prayers. Your third joke slips into this scene. Imagine a Roman sailor praying at an Isis temple in Gaul. "Protect me, great goddess," he says, but under his breath adds, "and maybe help me find a cute tavern girl after docking." Even far from the Nile, old habits die hard. As you wander through this Romanized landscape, you sense both continuity and loss. The laughter is still here, the dances still twirl, but the spirit feels bureaucratized. Egypt's sensual world, once tied to gods and mysteries, is now pressed into ledgers, taxed, and monitored. The intimacy remains, but the soul behind it flickers weaker. And yet, like papyrus roots pushing through sand, something endures. People still laugh, still flirt, still carve graffiti. Even empires can't erase desire. Rome may have changed Egypt's rules, but the Nile whispers the same truths it always has. Love and longing don't vanish, they adapt. The Roman shadows stretch long, and you feel the centuries slipping past. Markets close, temples fall silent, and the once sparkling taverns crumble into dust. Yet the stories refuse to die. They cling to walls, to papyrus fragments, to whispers across generations. Tonight, you don't just wander through Egypt, you wander through its echoes, still humming beneath modern life. Here's your mainstream fact: the tales of Egypt's courtesans, dancers, and companions didn't vanish with Rome. They resurfaced in medieval Arabic texts, in Renaissance curiosities, and in modern Egyptology. From the Turin erotic papyrus to love poems etched on shards of pottery, echoes of intimacy and humor survived. And scholars today still piece together these fragments, debating what they really meant. And the quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, some Victorian archaeologists were so scandalized by Egyptian erotic papyri that they locked them away, literally marking them restricted. For decades, only a handful of privileged scholars could peek at them. Imagine, thousands of years ago Egyptians laughed at bawdy drawings, and thousands of years later museum curators blushed at the same doodles. Historians still argue whether modern embarrassment has shaped how we interpret ancient joy. You pause by the Nile's edge, watching the moon shimmer on the water. Somewhere upriver, farmers still use amulets like their ancestors. Somewhere in Cairo's markets, sellers still hawk perfumes, oils, and honey, just as they did 3,000 years ago. The commerce of intimacy may have changed form, but its heartbeat is ancient. Your first joke drifts up naturally. Imagine an Egyptian artisan seeing modern dating apps. So, you swipe left for no and right for yes. We used fish symbols and lotus flowers, but hey, same idea. The scholarly debates continue. Were Egyptian courtesans sacred priestesses, or just skilled entertainers? Was the Turin papyrus high satire, or a private comic strip? Were charms and amulets genuine tools of attraction, or placebo magic? Historians still argue, and probably always will. But you, wandering through the echoes, see that the truth may be both. Intimacy in Egypt was sacred and silly, serious and playful, transactional and transcendent. You feel the centuries fold in. Hathor's laughter still dances on the breeze, Isis still whispers in the river, and the graffiti artists of Deir el-Medina still make you chuckle. Rome taxed it, Victorians hid it, but tonight, you heard it all. Your second joke glimmers here, a Victorian scholar, primly closing a papyrus box, best not let the ladies see this, while the ancient scribe who drew it cackles in his grave. Even today, scholars and travelers are drawn to the same themes: beauty, desire, play, humor, survival. Egypt left behind pyramids and temples, but also perfume bottles, love songs, and silly cartoons. Those lesser things may actually be greater, because they remind us that behind every monument were people, breathing, joking, blushing, flirting. And your third joke seals the feeling. Imagine one of those ancient graffiti donkeys, still grinning from a tomb wall, saying, "See? You remembered me, not the tax collector." The echoes of Egypt's courtesans and companions stretch into modern art, literature, even film. Each generation retells the story, adding its own flair. Some romanticize them, others critique them, but all are fascinated. Because deep down, intimacy is never just about the body, it's about power, laughter, survival, and mystery. The Nile glimmers one last time. Its waters have outlived dynasties, armies, empires, and yet it still carries whispers. Tonight, it carries these stories to you. And now, as the final images fade, you let yourself sink deeper into calm. The torches dim, the taverns go quiet, and the streets of ancient Thebes dissolve into mist. You feel the Nile's current slowing, its ripples softening like the steady rhythm of your own breath. What lingers isn't scandal or shock, it's humanity. The laughter in graffiti, the songs in taverns, the perfumes on skin, they remind you that across thousands of years, people have always sought connection. Sometimes sacred, sometimes silly, sometimes bold, sometimes secret. But always human. Your mind begins to drift, the details blurring gently, until only the feeling remains, a warmth, a wink, a sense that the past was never so distant after all. The companions of Egypt walked their own paths, full of risk and beauty, but they left behind ripples that reach you tonight. And you've walked with them for a while. As your breathing deepens, the rhythm steadies, like oars dipping into calm water, like papyrus reeds swaying in a night breeze. You imagine lying on a quiet riverbank, the stars glinting above, the fan beside you humming softly. Every sound grows slower, every thought less urgent. And soon, there is only stillness. So close your eyes now. Let the ancient voices slip into silence, leaving only peace behind. The Nile carries its secrets onward, but for you, the journey pauses here, in rest, in quiet, in sleep. Good night.